Today I'm going to talk about why meaning matters. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So one of the things that I found kind of strange about atheists in the last 10 to 15 years, roughly speaking, especially 10, because when I was a kid I had done some apologetics online at the time, in the very early stages of the internet, and then took a break for a while, did a lot of studying of things, and then came back to talking to atheists I did some talking one-on-one, but came back, and one of the really strange things about them was how aggressively they had given up on the concept of meaning, where a while ago it sort of posed a problem, a few decades ago, it kind of posed a problem to atheists, and they tended to insist, like, oh, your life can have meaning anyway. And nowadays, you're much more likely to meet people whose basic response is like, well, you don't need meaning in your life. You can just have whatever, you can give your life whatever meaning you want. And I've got some videos talking about why that's really stupid. But a really good example of what I'm talking about, just to sort of, make it clear. In Richard Dawkins' awful book, The God Delusion, it's a really, really bad book. And I only read part of it because I just couldn't stomach how awful it was. But there's this one part he talked about, he mentioned, I think it was the Prince of Wales. It was one of the English royals, because Dawkins, you'll recall, is English. And they were in the same room or something, and the royal, I think the Prince of Wales, it said something about, well, science talks about how, or science investigates how, but it doesn't investigate why. And Dawkins' commentary on this was, why is a stupid question? And this goes to show what an idiot Richard Dawkins is. If you can think, why is a stupid question, you're an idiot. I mean, genuinely, straight up, the man is an idiot. It's not an arguable sort of thing. And this sort of idiocy, though, you see it around. He was popular, and amongst the sort of people with whom he was popular, they tended to be similar kinds of idiots. And I mean this yes, I'm using insulting language, but I mean it very, very sincerely. I do not mean it cavalierly. Their basic approach is to say, like, yes, we want to be the cleverest of the beasts who crawl the earth, to use the whale of Ecclesiastes. We don't have meaning. We are just animals who go about doing not human activities, just animal activities, and we happen to be particularly clever about it. We happen to be really good at it. We've got these opposable thumbs, which are really neat. But that's it. We're just meaningless beasts. We live for a while for no purpose, no end, and then we die, and that's it. And they really, their sights were set very low. They actually did not want to understand anything. And this was a bit unusual. But one of the things, too, and it's kind of funny, because a lot of them, of course, historically speaking, there's sort of that split, I forget how many years ago now, but you can kind of trace it. I've talked about this in previous videos with the Atheism Plus, I think it was. I think there's some version of, I think, called Atheism 2.0, but Atheism Plus was the big one, which was Atheism Plus Social Justice, in which they basically just rolled out the religion substitute. And so what got really curious was that these atheists had united their atheism with a sort of moral indignation. And I mean, there's lots that can be said about it, and largely it was faux moral indignation. It was completely irrational. It was, largely self-puffery, where they're just thinking about how great they are and putting everyone else down to make themselves feel good, and so on. I mean, there's a lot that can be said. It's not, that part of it is not very relevant to the moment. But what is that they never really made the connection between meaning and morality. And so I just want to talk about that a little bit, in case you come across one of these poor creatures, you might be able to help it. Supposing, of course, it wants help. But the thing about it, and the thing that they tend to miss, is that meaning, and when we say meaning, like, what's the meaning of life, for example? What is the meaning of a thing? This is directly related to the concept of meaning that we use in, like, say, writing. So in writing, you have a bunch of letters in a row, and they either have a meaning or they do not have a meaning. So if you say, for example, table, chair, hippopotamus, rhinoceros, this does not mean anything, not in English. There could be various codes in which this has a meaning. There could be some other language in which these sounds happen to have a meaning. But in ordinary standard English, this does not have a meaning. It lacks a verb. It doesn't even have a subject. Or maybe it doesn't have an object. You can't really tell. It doesn't work. It does not put together into a coherent thing. It does not refer to anything real. And meaning, in the other sense, is that same concept. If you find a bunch of letters that just happen to look like a word, but they were, say, spilled onto the floor from a Scrabble box, the fact that, let's say just by sheer coincidence, these spilled letters from the Scrabble box spelled out "get help," you wouldn't go and get help for the Scrabble box, because it didn't mean it. It's not capable of meaning it. Those letters in that order don't communicate anything. They are not, in fact, symbols. They're just randomly, they are things people can use as symbols, but no one used them as symbols. They simply are accidentally in the same sort of arrangement that somebody who would use these as symbols might do. And I'm assuming you're standing there and saw the thing spill onto the floor, that there, let's say there was an earthquake, and, the box spilled over and you saw it, and you're like, that's kind of funny, bit ironic, given the earthquake and what the letters happen to spell out. But you know that it's not a real meaning because nobody meant it. Meaning there are two major components to meaning, and the first one I want to talk about is will. Nobody willed it. There was nobody who had this as an object and willed that it existed. This does not convey any message because there is no will behind it. It looks like a message, but is not. Now, obviously, this is essentially the problem that atheists have with literally the entire world, is that they hold that the world is a joke with no punchline that nobody has told. And, so I don't want to go down that sidetrack. So that's the first part about meaning. If you don't have a will that has willed the thing, there is no meaning to it. There is no significance to it. And this is a property of things that are put together. If you had a thing which was a unitary whole, which basically just means God, although possibly angelic intellects would not be composite beings. They might be unitary as well, though not in the same sense that God is. So without getting into angelology and that sort of thing, certainly everything we experience in the physical world is all composite beings. And so here we get to the other thing, the property of composite beings, that is the property of meaning, is reality. In order for things to actually be words, you need that intention behind them that gives them the reality of being words. Now, if the Scrabble box happened to fall over in an earthquake and spelled out, the letters happen to arrange with a bunch of random other letters, but there's GETHEL, one place, and HELP someplace else, and maybe it's not exactly a perfect line or whatever. That nobody meant it, so it's not a message. There's nothing being conveyed. But moreover, when you clean this up, you are not destroying anything, because there is not, in fact, a message here. You are not removing anybody's meaning. You're just removing this complete accident. Now, this complete accident happens coincidentally to be kind of interesting and humorous. So, it's not to say that there is nothing, because there is, the fact that it doesn't have any meaning is itself kind of interesting to us, because it reminds us of the fact that you can accidentally have things that look like other things but have a completely different substance to them. Because the substance of these letters is not a message. The substance of these letters is a pure accident. It's just the outward form of them that happens to look like a message. Anyway, if you're not watching the video, I just kind of smiled at the camera, because there's some things that connects to that I'm not going to get into. Anyway, the point here is the message is only real. The composite entity of the message is only real if there was will who willed that these things be together to have this meaning. The same thing applies to all of the composite entities that we actually deal with, because nobody deals with, elementary particles. We all deal with composite entities. I mean, individual elementary particles. Nobody tries to hold a conversation with a single electron, or to discourse to a neutrino. Nobody does those things. They do things with composite beings. And so the problem that the atheist runs into is, if you want to have any kind of morality, you need to hold that the things to which this morality applies to are real. It does not work. It doesn't make the least bit of sense to say this thing is not real. There is just the illusion of a person here. It's not a real person, but nonetheless we're going to punish you for breaking this illusion of a person, even though it's not real, because, there wasn't a person and there still isn't a person, so nothing's actually changed. But we sort of can mistakenly think that there's a person. We're reminded of the idea of a person. I mean, who the hell we are. The problem is these things always immediately break down. It's like all determinists can't speak in, determinists can't say anything consistently. Their only out is that they had to say the nonsense that they said, or the self-contradictory stuff that they said, so, can't blame them, unless you have to. But the point is, to say, like, it is wrong to, extreme examples are simpler. It is wrong to, let's say, set somebody on fire. Pour gasoline on them and set them on fire. It only makes any sense to say this is wrong if there's actually a person there. If there isn't a person, if there's simply a thing that looks like a person, then, well, who really cares? That's why burning somebody in effigy is not a crime. Ordinarily, anyway, because you haven't actually hurt anything. You've just taken something that happens to remind you of a person and destroyed that thing. But so what? As long as it's your property, no one really cares. Now, if there are no people to own property rights don't become an issue. And so to have any sort of moral qualm with pouring gasoline on a person and lighting them on fire entails holding that there actually is a person that you poured gasoline on and lit them on fire. If it's just a simulacrum that happens to remind you of a person, this is a pretty stupid thing to have a moral rule about. That it is terrible that you destroy this fake person, this not real person. Okay, and it is the meaning that is to say that there is a will that created the thing, this composite entity, as actually a thing, where the various parts are actually put together in order to be this composite thing, that is required in order to have any kind of morality at all, because it's required in order to have any sort of meaning. Otherwise, all you have is an accident that's exactly the same as when you have nonsense that happens to sound like words. And this is the problem they ran into. Now, to some degree, of course, one of their outs is that they're just trying to be the cleverest of the beasts that crawl the earth. They're not trying to actually, be rational. They're not trying to actually think. And I know it's kind of ironic because, often, especially during that 2005 to 2015 time frame, especially there with some bleed over on both sides, there's an awful lot of like logic and reason they didn't use any of those things. It was almost sort of a trademark that they used precisely no logic and absolutely no reason of any kind. Every once in a great while, maybe they touch on a little bit of evidence. But at the same time, this is the problem that they run into. And I'm sorry, this was their out, is that they weren't actually trying to think. So the mere fact that they didn't think, the fact that they're ludicrously self-contradictory, that what they're doing is in no sense rational whatsoever, isn't really a problem because they're not trying to be rational. They're occasionally pretending to be rational. Sometimes they'll call themselves rational because, hey, it's fun. And to some degree, and this is part of why, I don't have a very high opinion of most of them, because they're not doing the sort of thing for which, they're sort of explicitly, if you really push them, if you get sort of behind the slogans and see, what is it they actually think of themselves, what is it that they think that they're doing, they're not actually trying to be reasonable. They don't even think that they're trying to be reasonable. They will straight up tell you that reason doesn't work on anything where you don't like the conclusions. Maybe human reason only works for making iPhones, but, doesn't go any further. Outside of the realm of what you can practically test, human reason works when you test it and it works, and it doesn't where it doesn't, and you can't trust it, and, well, you've just thrown out logic. You've just said that the laws of logic don't actually work. And then they'll wail and gnash their teeth, but that's what they said. And if you try to actually hold conversations, you will find this out. Just push them and like find out what their meaning behind their words are, and then ask a lot of clarificational questions, and you'll find out that's what they mean. So for, especially, I think, younger ones are probably more helpable than older ones, because they haven't, gotten nearly as enmeshed in it, and they may possibly be making a mistake rather than be, sort of choosing this very irrational path. The thing about it is they don't, so they're, when they try to assume meaning but still act as if they have meaning, where they're not just embracing being inconsistent, the problem they run into, they don't realize that they are using meaning. What they're doing, for the most part, is they refer to concepts that they've never questioned. And they take these for granted and don't think that any special terms apply to them, such as meaning. That when, this is a person, and they say, well, everyone knows that this is a person. Everyone knows what this means. Like, your whole worldview is claiming that the things that everybody knows are actually an illusion. So maybe think through this just a little bit, perhaps, but doesn't actually work anyway. So, like grabbing them and shaking them. I've never actually tried it. You really, you have this instinct that maybe if you just shook them hard enough, they'd actually start, like, noticing that they just said that their entire worldview is that the things that are commonly known, such as things like including free will, are all actually illusory. So, like, but nonetheless, what they do is they use these concepts that they've never questioned, and they tend to, like, put them in just a different category. Like, nobody has disputed this, so even though the things that I'm saying apply to it, we're not going to apply them over here, because the things that I'm saying are only about the stuff that we're disputing. They're only about disputed stuff, and so even though I'm making these universal claims about the nature of reality, I'm going to bracket it over here in the part where we disagree, and this stuff where we agree, I mean, even though we don't actually, but, I don't know enough about what you think or what anyone thinks. I've never thought this through, so I don't really know. But I'm going to assume we all agree on these things. And so those things we're going to bracket over here and just use these concepts that we all agree on, and not question them and not pay any attention whatsoever to the universal claims that I'm making when we disagree about things, or that I'm claiming are actually true. And So that's why these things are all safe, and I don't need to worry about meaning, because I'm just going to smuggle the concept in over here without thinking about it, and because I don't think about it, I don't have to apply my thoughts over to it. Yeah, so odds of being able to help somebody like this aren't very great. And that's why I say, especially for younger people, if you can possibly get them to notice this is what they're actually doing, like once one of these people hits their 30s, 40s, 50s, they tend to be fairly set in their ways. They tend to be fairly enmeshed in it. And it's all the more painful to realize that they've been lying to themselves and everybody else for, all of their life since they were basically a teenager, or possibly all their life. And so, that's why I say, it may be more helpful when talking to younger people. And as Eve Kanainen has mentioned, atheism is essentially a degenerative disease, and one of the things that it affects typically is people's honesty, where they just stop being concerned with whether or not the universal, the things that they use to describe reality are true or not. They just kind of, over time, seem to stop caring. Some faster than others, some slower than others. Like the fact that the things that they're saying are self-contradictory stops bothering them after a while, and that's really sad when you see that. Individuals vary, so by the way, don't presume that somebody is set in their ways just because they're older, or that they're flexible because they're younger. So, really what I mean is, people who are at least still thinking about it and who haven't really, really committed such that turning their entire life around would be, require heroic virtue. Just turning their life around would still require ordinary virtue is kind of what I'm talking about. But anyway, so, and there's a sort of, in a sense, repetitiveness to when I talk about these things, because it always comes down to the fact that they have chosen to be irrational, and you stop there. Like you can't go. There's nowhere for an argument to proceed once a person has rejected reason. So it's always going to come down to that. We're always going to sort of arrive at that same place, because the fundamental problem is that we're talking about people who have rejected reason. And so, you can push it for a while, and then eventually it comes there. And what all of these different things, the various videos that I've made that kind of end up here, are trying to get at are various ways to help people realize that that's what they're doing. That one way may not work, but there may be some other way where you show them how the problem is their worldview does not permit the things that they think are more certain than their worldview. And, most of the time when you do that, what happens, they go, there must be some problem in here. I can't really see what the problem is that like makes these two things not actually, the problem with what you've presented. Like, yeah, I see how you're showing it's contradictory, but there's probably some flaw in what you're showing. I don't know what it is. So I just, I'll deal with this later, and later never comes. That's usually how it will go. And it's not entirely rational to say, like, I'm fairly confident both of these things. I see what you mean, and it does seem to show that they contradict, but I think there must be some problem here. There's something that's being missed that makes them not actually contradictory, only apparently contradictory. I have a video on the difference between true contradiction and apparent contradiction. And that's a legitimate distinction. And, so that's a legitimate thing to do, and then, just sort of push this thinking it through to some other time that never actually shows up. But that doesn't always happen, and sometimes it might make them actually start thinking. It might make them actually start trying to figure something out, and, being actually bothered by it, and trying to, actually ask themselves some real questions. And what is the thing that catches their attention and gets them to actually ask some real questions and, make them think whether or not they really truly do mean to reject reason, or whether, they're not committed to that. So that's why I bring this up, even though it kind of ends up in the same place every time. So until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.